Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games. I'm Geoff Moonen.
I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon, and thank you for joining us yet again. I'm excited to be recording again with my good friend, Geoff.
Aw, shucks. You're pretty okay, too.
It depends on the day.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, today we wanted to talk about something near and dear, certainly to my heart.
Mine, too.
Absolutely. The idea of the death of the console. Now, I think, I'd have to recount this in my head, I think I own 14 different home consoles.
Wow.
That's not counting handhelds or anything like that. Plug into the TV only, I own, I think 14 consoles. And most of them I have plugged in, and I play them.
Yeah, I have owned probably that many, but I don't currently own them. Back in the days of high school, I was very much into this thing called money. And so back in the early days of trading in, when you still got some semblance of a value, I traded in a lot of my old stuff to get the new stuff because my parents refused to buy me the new stuff, which is fine and legit because I had a ton of games. So I didn't keep anything, which I regret now because I wish I had some of those things. Yeah. As I am a collector now.
Yeah, I'm a collector as well. And bear in mind, I did sell 90% of my video game collection in college. I sold every home console I sold.
Wow.
Like all of these are reacquisitions one way or the other, whether I found them at a flea market or a friend was getting rid of their old console. And now after, 2.5 decades of knowing that Geoff is going to accept Geoff will accept your trash. Geoff will treasure your trash. My friend Kieran had to get rid of a lot of his gaming magazine collection.
Oh, wow.
All of it came to me.
Nice.
All of his old Nintendo Power Guides, which are now on my bookshelf. I should get some pictures of that. And some comics and games and some of those systems as well. And so this is all reacquisition within the last 10 years.
Yeah. And of stuff that's, for the most part, for a lot of this stuff, out of print or doesn't exist anymore.
Absolutely.
That's kind of the nature of gaming these days. Unless you're a PC gamer, you always, and even as a PC gamer, you still have to buy new hardware.
And some games don't carry over anymore. So you don't necessarily see the death of the console, but you see the death of the system.
Yeah.
In a way like, okay, when Windows 95 went to Windows 98 or when people finally went to, XP or anything like that, those games that you could no longer carry with you. And so in a way, there was a system death.
Yeah, it's less so now because of Steam, and pretty much if there's an older game on Steam, they've ported it in a way that you can play it on any interface
They create those emulation setups. I remember first being introduced to that a number of years ago when Scum VM came out.
Yes.
Because I'm a big fan of the old LucasArts point-and-click games, and finding out that I could finally replay Sam & Max Hit the Road was, oh my God, happy days.
But we want to chat a bit about the actual life cycle of gaming consoles, and more importantly, the death of a gaming console. This idea that eventually, I guess the sign of the times now is GameStop stops selling or supporting it, and so where the hell do you get it? We have stuff like eBay, and the like that you can order old stuff, and even Amazon, now that people can sell their crap on Amazon, it's easier to get this older stuff. But there are plenty of consoles that I cherish that died that I don't know that I would play anymore. Or the fact that certain modern consoles with online support, once that ends for a console, does that kill it, or do people still play it?
Absolutely. I mean, as of the recording of this episode, the Wii U has been sort of declared dead in a number of ways, mostly because Nintendo is not releasing any more games for it. It is, most projects where people were like, oh yeah, I'm going to develop for this, they're developing for the Switch, or they've dropped it altogether. I think it's also they've stopped production of new Wii U consoles.
Correct.
I think that was, now that I'm saying this out loud, I think that's really it's dead now. We're not making any more. None more are being birthed.
Yes. But they are still supporting the online stuff and the Miiverse for it, and there are online games that you can still play. But eventually that'll end too. And I think it's one of those things where, we've mentioned previously our love of certain game genres that end, and the fact that there are rebirths of them. And the consoles go through the same motion. I mean, for me, I loved the Xbox 360 the entire time I had it. It's not by far my favorite game console, but it was definitely up there as far as modern gaming consoles, what I enjoyed. I had a huge Xbox Live library. I have all these games. And even when you stop paying for Xbox Live on the 360, you keep the local version of the game. So you can still play anything you got for free through Gold. But it slowly died for me. Now that I have a new PC. I'm playing a lot of PC games again. I got a PS4, which I have a bunch of games for that I still haven't finished. And now I just got the Switch. It's like, I'm not going to play this old 360, and I have all these games, but it's at a point now where they're worth nada at GameStop. I could sell it online, but it's not really worth much there either, because the modern consoles just don't retain the value that other systems do. And with the re-release of tons of games on the newer systems, like HD re-releases and blah, 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 the console's life cycle gets even shorter and shorter. And as a DVD player, I don't really need it either, because I can hook up a laptop to my TV directly and play stuff on that. And of course, the PS4 plays DVDs.
Absolutely. And it's actually interesting that you mention that games sort of lose their value in a way, or they don't retain their value.
Yeah.
I feel a lot of games nowadays don't necessarily. I mean, people have been bemoaning the loss of instruction manuals, and
I'm one of those people.
And sort of the feelies in the release of a game. And are they necessary anymore? Probably not. No. Are they great? Yes, they are. I will maintain that up and down forever. They do enhance the experience, but are they necessary? No. Does it save you money? Absolutely. And if it's going to mean that the game gets released or it's more accessible, yeah, that's the first thing to go. That's fine. It's unfortunately like the arts budget at a school. But sorry, that's a little too political. But let's not get into that argument. Anyway. But the fact is, without all of those things, and the fact that there's a lot more digital distribution of games, even within the console that they are released physically, it's one thing to be able to easily access on a virtual console a copy of Super Mario Bros. 3.
Right.
But to own the cartridge of Super Mario Bros. 3 has value.
Yeah.
To have the physical copy of Final Fantasy 13, not as much.
Yeah.
Both because it was easier to get your hands on in a digital sense and everything else, and because of that simultaneous release, its physical hold really doesn't have a hold on us.
Yeah, I think that to pertain to the other podcasts I do. I'm a music podcaster as well, and I do my website, crashchords.com, and we talk a lot about music, and we've talked in the past about physical media, and this idea that I still love owning CDs because I like liner notes. I like to see lyrics. I like to know who produced what, but it's not really a thing anymore. Now liner notes, if you make something on Bandcamp and release it, they release the digital PDF of it, which is fine. And it makes sense to not incur the cost of that if making the digital version is way easier for you than making a physical version. But I love the instruction manuals in the Nintendo years. I love strategy guides. I still have my Super Mario RPG strategy guide, and the artwork is great in that. But it was weird. I opened the Breath of the Wild case, they're reminiscent of the PSP cases. They're kind of longer, and thinner than other game system boxes. But when I opened it, it was a plastic case. There's, of course, a beautiful scene of Hyrule underneath the plastic that you can see on the backside of the image that's printed and put in the box.
Because it's a clear case.
Because it's a clear case. And then there's the little SD card looking cartridge and no instruction manual. There's still the little clips in the box for it, but there's no instruction manual.
Right.
There's no insert, because now everything is done digitally through syncing up accounts. There's not even a code for My Nintendo to get points from your My Nintendo account. Now, because it's attached to your Nintendo ID, it just, as soon as you play the game the first time, it recognizes it and you just get the points. There's nothing in the boxes anymore. And it's really interesting. And I think in the respect with gaming consoles and the fact that they've I feel like the older ones are more obsolete and considered dead, because not only are they not printing new games, they're not making new consoles, but they're also not even making the hardware that you use for those consoles, or the power cords. I think about how the RF switch for the Nintendo, and that most TVs don't even have that anymore.
And it's a very interesting thing, because the big question here is, when exactly does a console die, or if a console can die? And the NES is an interesting case to look at because, for a number of reasons. One of which is the fact that even though they stopped producing, Nintendo stopped publishing games for it a number of years ago. I mean, this is 2017. They stopped, 1994? Something like that?
Something like that.
I didn't fact check that. What I did fact check was the fact that Nintendo customer service continued to support and repair your NES up until October 31st, 2007. 10 years ago, only 10 years ago, they stopped first party from within the company supporting, repairing, replacing the Nintendo Entertainment System.
That's insane. I'm curious to know about like the original Game Boys and the Super Nintendos, if they're still supporting those. But that's crazy.
They probably still support a few of them, and I think they're slowly dropping it off. I haven't checked. This might be, new presidents, new changeovers. That's gone.
Yeah.
But I remember it being always such an interesting point that Nintendo still supported those things. They still stood behind it. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, while it was dormant or while it was kind of old, it was still it wasn't dead. Yeah. It was in the home. It was being taken care of by the people who made it.
Well, and I think also a part of that might be just that the parts aren't available anymore. Maybe it's just outdated, so they couldn't support it anymore. But that said, like, it's still really fascinating that they stopped supporting it at that time so much later than technically the system had died. I mean, also with like re-releases of consoles, the fact that we have the NES Classic and it's released with games installed on it already and it's impossible to find and blah, 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 blah. But the fact that they're still doing that stuff and they have a huge digital library and that you can buy older games, it never ever really felt like the Nintendo was dead. I mean, because once we got to the DS and 3DS generation, the Virtual Console, and even on the Wii, the Virtual Console was huge, and you could buy all of these classic games, which I think my biggest regret about getting rid of my Wii, besides the fact that I never played it, and that system truly did die for me, is that I had Super Metroid, Super Castlevania, Chrono Trigger, of course, Mario RPG, like all of these classic games that I loved on it. And you can bet your ass, if they release those games on the Switch, I'm going to buy those games. Because I still long for a portable version of Super Mario RPG. There's never been a portable version.
Yeah, right.
But, so to me, the Nintendo never really felt dead. But think about the original Xbox. That's a system that feels dead to me. Like, there's no backwards compatibility with or very limited with the 360 to the regular Xbox.
There was some, I feel, because I've got both an Xbox and an Xbox 360. There's a little bit of crossover there, but even that was dodgy emulation.
Yeah.
And I mean, most backwards compatibility aside from Wii to GameCube, if I'm not mistaken, and certainly some of the Nintendo handhelds, those were hardware. Mm-hmm. They had the pieces to play it, but everything else has been an emulation framework.
Yeah, and that's why the Wii U doesn't have backwards compatibility with anything before it, and that's why the Switch probably won't. The Switch is a completely different system. There's no discs, no nothing, so there won't be. I mean, I think it would be cool if companies honored, like, if you own this game, put in this barcode and we'll give you a digital version. But the Xbox is a system that I never owned. Friends did, but like, besides the releases of like Halo and a couple of other games that were up-resed, that system to me felt dead pretty much as soon as they converted Xbox Live to the 360 and killed Xbox Live. Whereas you think about something like the Game Gear, which has probably been dead for much longer, considering it never had very good battery support, the fact that it drained batteries like a motherfucker unless you plugged it in, and that the games, the third-party stuff was never really great for it, but the Sega stuff was. And
the good third-party stuff really didn't come out in great quantities.
No, like I remember getting a Mega Man game for the Game Gear, but it was incredibly hard to find.
Yes, it was. Or like, what was it, Beyond Oasis, I think, mm-hmm. or I'm blanking on it. But yeah, there was a great RPG for it. There's all kinds of things that they were difficult to get your hands on. And the Game Gear is an interesting one because it was a system that had a brief resurgence mm-hmm. because of, I believe it was Majesco was the company that sort of got their hands on the rights and were sold them and everything else. And they did a full re-release of the Game Gear console. And so when you go, and if you're a retro collector and you go to get a Game Gear, it's a question of whether or not it's one of the Sega ones or Majesco. There's a few subtle differences and, it's worth talking about, I suppose, not right now. And it didn't go very far. It didn't necessarily get any new games out.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting state of, are those considered true Game Gears? Well, they sort of are.
Yeah.
And to some people, I'm sure they sort of aren't.
Yeah.
Which is one of those interesting things, which brings me to the topic of homebrew.
Right.
Because, I mean, the phrase, the term, I'm sure conjures up all kinds of images depending upon who hears it. Right. But as far as homebrew games go, there are companies, full-on companies, not just people in their basement, and never let it be said that people in their basement can't produce something amazing for gaming. But as far as either legality or public perception, what have you, companies that are still developing and publishing games for, off the top of my head, I know that there are NES games, that there are Genesis games, that there are Sega Dreamcast games. Dreamcast is actually a big one that has a huge homebrew community compared to other systems. Huge in general, I don't know, but huge compared to other ones, absolutely.
Yeah, this idea that you can create new games for old systems and recycle, sprites and other things, I think is really great, and it kind of breathes life into these consoles that you think might be dead. And the idea that you can kind of, or even think of, the Shovel Knights of the world, the fact that these publishers are creating brand new games, but absolutely rooted in old school mechanics, and the fact that, if they release Shovel Knight for the Nintendo, I'm sure a lot of people would actually buy it.
The funny thing is, Shovel Knight is too advanced for the NES.
That's true, yeah.
And it's not for the reasons you think. Most of it's the color palette.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it just
and the sprite limit.
Yes.
Color palette and sprite limit. Those are the two that I can think of right now that an NES would chug so hard on that, not in a good way.
But it's the idea that you could create games that feel old and that are for those old systems that are actually quite new, and it breathes new life into these consoles. But I don't foresee people doing that really with more modern consoles like your 360 or your PS3 or even PS2 and the N64. And not to say that nobody does, but it definitely doesn't seem as prevalent to me as the more retro stuff.
Absolutely. And this may be something that we'll see more of as, modern young gamers grow up.
Yeah.
But there's certain symbolism or symbiology of older systems that we sort of associate either the games with them, the shapes of the cartridges, the colors of the packaging.
Yeah.
All of these other little pieces that maybe came from that were rooted in its history of physical releases.
Yeah.
That there is a certain sense of, no, I absolutely agree. There's a feeling of, these were NES games. These were Sega Genesis games. These were Master System games versus there's all this 360 stuff. Like, these are cheap things. These are whatever else. They were on these other systems. It's no big deal.
Well, it's also because back then it was you either had a Genesis or Super Nintendo, and you either played Genesis games or Nintendo games. There was some cross-platform stuff, but back then, like Mortal Kombat on the Super Nintendo had no blood because Nintendo didn't want blood, whereas the
Genesis had a blood code.
Like, there were also there would be Ninja Turtles fighting games for both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, but they were completely different games by different companies.
And there was actually one for the NES as well.
Yeah. And
that's the only one I played.
And the idea that, there were games that were cross-platform, but either the same publisher would make very different games or it would be different publishers altogether. The fact that the side-scrolling beat-em-up, like the TMNT 2 arcade game, and then like Turtles in Time for the Super Nintendo, when it finally made it to the Genesis, it was similar but different. They had the Hyperstone Heist, which was still a side-scrolling beat-em-up like the Super Nintendo game was, but it was a little different. The narrative was different and all of these things. Whereas now it's, just put it on the other systems. It's a port, but essentially, if it comes out for System A, it could come out for System B and C too, and it's not that uncommon.
And that's one of the things that I think why Nintendo consoles have maintained that sense of identity even into the modern age, because of the fact that they've never, well, certainly in the last 2 or 3 generations, tried to keep up with the Joneses in terms of graphical quality. When that Ghostbusters game came out a number of years ago, where it was sort of like the pseudo third Ghostbusters movie idea, etc. When it was released on Sony and Microsoft, they were virtually identical.
Yeah.
They were more movie-ish.
Yeah.
They had greater fidelity with that and everything else. Whereas the Wii version, because they couldn't match that, they went, well, let's just go differently.
Yeah.
It was more stylized in its look. It was a different game.
Yeah.
But it was still a Ghostbusters game. Like, that doesn't happen as much anymore. You're right.
Yeah.
It's you're not embracing the limitations or the specifics of the system. You're going, well, what's the best possible, or how close can we get with this? Which still happened way back when. I mean, so many... You look at the advertising splats on old games, on the boxes, on the cartridges. It's like arcade perfect port.
Yeah.
That idea of, we were trying to match the arcade. Whereas nowadays, we're trying to match PCs.
Yeah.
The problem is, you had to go out to get to the arcade. Your PC is at home.
Yeah. And I think that, PC gaming is something that's always going to perpetuate gaming culture to evolve, I think, because, essentially now with the advent of Steam, like I've mentioned before, if you have a Steam library, that's your that's your games. And no matter what computer you get, you'll always have that Steam library, with my exception of City of Heroes, which we'll talk about another time, that I still mourn for. It's on my game list on Steam. I can't remove it, but I cannot play it. But, you know, for the most part, and if you couldn't tell, I'm a little salty about that. For the most part, though, with gaming consoles, it's like, I mean, think about the 360 now and how I mentioned earlier. If I get rid of it, I'm getting rid of those games. And honestly, a lot of those games I've been able to get for, like, if there were with Steam sales eventually, I could probably get all 30 games I have on the 360 for a few dollars at some point on Steam. I'll get rid of my 360 because why would I play them anymore? I'm already considering getting the Mass Effect trilogy on PC because I'll probably get Andromeda on PC which I haven't bought yet. But because why would I get it on the PS4? It just means when the PS5 and the next Xbox come out, I can't play the next Mass Effect game on that same console. Whereas at least on the PC, I'll have synergy. Like stuff that's a trilogy, I feel like there's no reason to buy it on Xbox or the PS4 because I'd rather just have it on the PC and keep everything together. Whereas Nintendo still holds that, you know, wholesomeness of if you want to play Zelda, if you want to play Mario, if you want to play Metroid, if you want to play Zelda, you have to buy our system. And while it's kind of a con for those who aren't Nintendo fans.
And a bit draconian when you think about it. However, Nintendo's always been a bit draconian.
And you know what, though? I still bought their brand new system because I wanted to play the new damn Zelda, and it worked. So, and it's great. So, you know, while I wish that they would have more cross-party support, you know, I'm less salty about that, I suppose. I guess it's just the consoles seem to have less identity now. More or less, it's whatever big corporation's attached to it. Otherwise, you're playing on a PC.
Absolutely. And I was actually running into this in kind of reading about game development and whatnot because neither Matt nor I are game developers.
Correct.
We are educated fans at best.
Yes.
You know, even anything that I've done within a video game in its production, the few games that I have, purely artistic, nothing development-wise. Regardless, there's a disappearing middle class as far as game development goes, where most major titles that come out take years to develop, yet despite having dozens of people working on it and so much money, because gaming itself or the gaming industry has reached such a point of needing money or of making money and all of this that you can't take as many risks. And so why would you differentiate the versions? I absolutely understand why they do it.
Right.
But I do sort of mourn the loss of that kind of console identity.
Yeah.
And I feel like, and maybe it's just because I prefer some of the more Sony exclusive properties.
Right.
Like, you know, playing Final Fantasy on the Xbox feels weird to me.
It does, you know, or the fact that they're working on a Final Fantasy VII re-release, which of course we'll both get.
Yep.
And I definitely want to do an episode on that because I have feelings on. There are a lot of purists out there. This is just a shorter side purists going, "Oh, I hope they don't change anything." But then, what's the point of re-releasing it?
Change the game,
please.
I love Final Fantasy VII so much.
I want additional story and new game mechanics.
Yeah, if you want to change up, if you want to change the story, you want to do all that. You know what? I still have multiple copies of Final Fantasy VII for the PS1. I can just go and play it.
Right.
You haven't ruined that by making a re-release. And you know what? Maybe somebody else will get interested in Final Fantasy. I'd rather that. But all in the end, I would like to enjoy it.
Well, sure. Well, it was like the first time I played a Sonic game on a Nintendo system. I was like, this feels wrong. Like on every level, this feels wrong. You know, whereas now Sega's, I mean, being way more promoted for all of their kind of quirky and interesting games they're producing, like the Bayonetta series wouldn't have had the life it had if it weren't for Sega. And it's become a huge success.
Absolutely.
You know, but it takes me back to this idea of consoles and like when they truly die. I think modern consoles probably truly die when their online support stops. You got to think about how if you played Halo quick matches all the time, that was your game, that was your online experience. When Xbox One stopped that, and until they re-released Halo 1 with the Halo, I think, Reach multiplayer engine attached, you couldn't play that game you loved online anymore. You know, the fact that the Wii no longer supports Mario Kart online, and so unless you bought the Wii U with the new Mario Kart, you couldn't play online. I think that's a huge end to the life cycle since online gaming is promoted over local playing. Whereas the Switch, I think, might have a different future because both local and online multiplayer seems to be seamless for it.
Seems to be, certainly. With time will tell on that.
But, you know, I think whereas older consoles, they died when production stopped. The fact that they stopped making a Sega Genesis or any of its games. But then eventually they made the Sega Nomad, where you could play those Genesis games on the go, and that system tanked
Quickly.
You know, I think a life cycle of a console is really dependent on also the fan base for it. The fact that I think the Nintendo Entertainment System never felt like it died, or the Famicom if you're Japanese, or for that side of the planet at least. It never died because the games were always available digital. There was a huge emulator culture behind it. And I feel like we were always playing those games, whether it was finger quotes legal or not. You were always playing those games. Whereas something like the original Xbox or even the PlayStation 1, while sure, or even the PlayStation 2, the Final Fantasy games, ubiquitous. But who else has played The Bouncer on PS2 recently? You know, whereas I own that game. You know, or the original Devil May Cry, which I loved on the PlayStation 2.
I played that recently.
You know, but those kinds of games, unless the series are continuing, those games kind of just fall off and die. Like the No More Heroes series, I really liked on the Wii. I don't know that it'll ever continue, though. It felt like, you know, I mean, Pseudo51 is for sure going to keep making games because he always makes ridiculously bizarre games that are huge hits.
God bless that man.
But, you know, he always usually changes the series up because, you know, Killer 7 was great. It didn't need a sequel. You know, I love both No More Heroes games and so on. But I don't think those games will live on, and more importantly, those console versions either. You know,
one of the difficulties there is a lot of times in order to get a property released, you almost have to sell the rights for it.
Yeah.
And certain creators, certain people have either clout or financial backing that they can hold on to it. But a lot of reasons why certain sequels don't happen is because they don't own it anymore. Like smaller companies that make something interesting, then it gets given to a larger studio.
Yeah.
And whether they make a better game or not, that's up for debate. But these things pass around and then they can't make it anymore.
Right.
And it's very interesting that you bring up online gaming because it's kind of like the idea of, for me, a lot of this comes back to sort of that quote about people, you know, someone isn't truly dead until people stop talking about them.
Right.
And in the sense of a video game console, eventually the company that makes it turns off the lights.
Yeah.
Now, can you keep it going with the lights off, or what will you do with the lights off is really the big question. The NES, if they stop making games, they stop producing the consoles, it doesn't change your experience with it. Right. You know, you might need to figure out a little better how to get it to work on your current TV, or you might need to be very careful with things, or like, you know, the community that forms up in the second or third life of a console or stage of life as people talk about it. You're talking about, you know, your 360, the experience sort of dying for you. I didn't get a 360 until recently, maybe the last 2 years, I think.
Okay.
And so a lot of my, really the thing is, I haven't bought any 360 games new.
Yeah.
I have a number of 360 games, but I almost treat it as I do whenever I collect for any other console, and it's finding those games, finding those deals, finding whatever. But the thing is, I never am getting to play any of the online stuff.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of coming to the system already inert.
Right. Well, and also, like, some online gaming is shoehorned. Like, I got the Uncharted collection for PS4 because I never owned a PS3.
Right.
And so I wanted to play the Uncharted games because I've heard they're phenomenal. And spoiler alert, they are. I'm halfway through the third one, and I beat the crap out of the first two. And the interesting thing is, when they ported it to the PS4, they up-res the graphics and removed all of the multiplayer. They claimed for space reasons, but let's be honest, nobody played that multiplayer. You know, I imagine when they do an HD re-release of all of the early Assassin's Creed games, they'll do the same thing. And, you know, I think that it depends on the kind of multiplayer. When you're dealing with a game like Smash Brothers or Mario Kart, the in-person gaming experience, I think, is better, and the online gaming experience is okay. So it affects Nintendo less. Whereas when you have something like Halo or Call of Duty or Battlefield,
they live or die by their online community.
Yeah, and then there are games that are in the middle. Like Mass Effect 3 had a great online co-op mode. There was not online versus; it was you versus waves of enemies, and it was so much fun. And I would have played that game maybe on its own because it really was a lot of fun, and it doesn't seem like that persisted. I haven't spoken to anybody who bought Andromeda, but I don't think that multiplayer aspect is on that. I think it's just a single player game again, which is fine. But, it's curious to me what lives and dies by the online. And for sure, a lot of modern console gaming does. I mean, I think Xbox Live, as far as I know, is still running for the 360. I think the reason they had to turn it off for the Xbox One, the Xbox to the Xbox 360 is they were different setups. And in order to pool all of the resources from one, they had to move it to the other. Whereas I believe 360 and Xbox One are existing on the same live system. Just what you have access to varies based on what console you're using.
Well, also, absolutely, Xbox Live was one of the first big, popular, widespread online platforms like that.
Yeah.
And so they had a lot of kinks to work out with that. And so I would say with 360, that Xbox Live experience was a more polished... They'd kind of gotten over their growing pains.
Yeah.
And so it's much easier to keep all of that intact and think of the future when you do it.
For sure. Whereas like someone like Sony had free online for a while, but their community system wasn't great. And then with the PS4, they finally kind of doubled back and did the PS Plus, which they persisted this idea of you pay monthly. Not only do you get access to online games, but you can also get free games, which is kind of been the standard now for paid subscriptions. And it would not shock me if the Nintendo goes into the same route eventually. The online for the Switch is still very basic. And it had, their online had always been pretty basic, even for the Wii and the Wii U. And so I imagine they're going to flesh that out a bit. But since the console is still built around taking it with you, they may not need to do what the other consoles are doing.
Right. I mean, they'll do their own spin on it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting to look at the free games that come through PS Plus.
Yeah.
Because while when they announce things and any sort of big thing or whenever a major news outlet talks about it, they only talk about the PS4 games.
Yeah.
But this ignores the fact that they are still releasing games in that way for the PS3 and the PS Vita.
Correct.
And they allow, if there is cross-buy, they allow cross-play with it. Mm-hmm. So as somebody who owns a Vita and a PS4, it's always a lot of fun to see those and enjoy that. And PS Vita, I find, is a very interesting example in talking about dead consoles.
Sure.
Because there is still technically support. There is still sort of online community going on with that. And clearly Sony remembers that it exists at least once a month.
Right.
In many ways, from releases and everything else, it almost sounds as though Sony has already written it off, or that they've written it off multiple times. Certainly several people have. Games do still come out for it, and there is still, because it is sort of like a I don't know what word I would want to use for it. I don't think it's dead. I don't think it's in stasis. I don't think it's sick or anything like that, but it is certainly diminished.
Yeah.
You have companies that almost go, no, but we want to make games for the Vita.
Yeah.
And I mean, intriguingly, it developed its own identity into, there's a lot of visual novels on it. There's a lot more. It definitely has more of a, dare I say it, weeaboo vibe.
Yeah.
And look, I'll embrace that. I'm a weeaboo in certain aspects of my life. It's not an all over thing, but sometimes it's just nice to go into my corner with my Vita. Don't judge me.
But yeah, I think handheld gaming consoles is a different experience for life cycles, because thinking about, for the most part, besides the one-off handhelds that, what was the company? Tiger made those handheld?
Tiger made a lot of different things.
So they're handheld one-offs, but Nintendo pretty much drove that ship forever. And the fact that the Game Boy Color, the Advance, the mini GameCube, the mini Game Boy, the DS, the 3DS, all of these consoles kept perpetuating this life of the portable gaming system and never really ever die, because there's as much as they can, they always did cross-platform on the handhelds. The fact that until I got the 3DS, I still play my Game Boy Advance games.
I mean, I still play them too, but it's just a matter of which systems do I take with me on my morning commute.
Right. And this idea that I think they are less likely to die because of how portable they are, how little space their games take up. And I think, space and physicality is a big part of it too. I feel like as we move into the next generation gaming, and we're starting to see it a bit with the Switch, and we'll see it more as Xbox and Sony start to work on their next consoles, there's a lot larger focus on digital gaming.
Yes.
And so I feel like Switch's stuff, because you can absolutely buy any of their main platform games digitally or on the console, and you could do that with the 3DS, there's going to be more cross-platform and eventually backwards compatibility, because it'll be a digital file. It'll be an emulation. It won't be the actual cartridge or disc. And I think that's the direction we're headed in, because Steam's been doing that for years. The idea that they don't have a console because they have a system, and you use that web system, and any game you have can play on any computer you have, unless it's Mac or PC, which is a whole other story. And I think that digital route is going to change the death, the life cycles and eventual death of consoles. The reason consoles die now is because it's a hard copy. You can only play on that physical system. And as that continues to shift and evolve, this thing may be less of a problem in years to come.
And more of a problem as well. One of the reasons it's easier to keep certain systems alive in a way, and it then turns into a question of what is a living console.
Right.
If you're going to still develop for it, having an all-digital release platform or a mode makes perfect sense.
Right.
Like you can develop these things, and if they never release any physical versions of these games in the first place, well, then you can still develop for the Switch. 10 years after they've said no to it, because you can then just release it if there's still a distribution method.
Right.
It's that idea of people worry about buying things through Steam because if one day Steam collapses, things fall apart,
you lose everything.
All those games are gone.
Yeah.
Whereas like a Super Nintendo, you can still find the cartridges, and when you find the cartridges, you can still play the game. But that's also a console that has no online identity.
Right. Well, yeah, it's this idea of DRM and what you actually own, and the fact that if Steam or the company Steam works with, or Apple Music, if you're online, or even iTunes, they decide this isn't yours anymore, we're taking it back, and they remove your DRM, that's it. You can't get it. It's gone. It disappears from your library. And I think that's an unfortunate thing and a scary thing on the flip side of it. The idea that if eventually all consoles go digital, what if Sony decides, we don't want you to have games anymore. We're going to take them all back. There's not a lot of legality covering that stuff.
We ran into that a little bit with PT.
Yes.
People loved PT. I mean, I never got to play it. I've watched countless videos. The
Me
story
too.
of it. Oh my God,
it's so good.
It's so good, and it's so tragic in its way. But there came a point where you can no longer download it. But then people went, well, I've already downloaded it, so I've got it. And then it got, was it got corrupted, or it got like patched out, basically, out of the system. So you can no longer hold on to it. So now a piece of this exists only as video files, not as anything playable. And I mean, that's just as much of a worry with, physical things that can degrade. But this brings into questions of ownership, and is it, are you renting it from people? And while this may not be a big deal for certain kinds of gamers or certain kinds of games, I mean, there are plenty of games that I could play once and I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to experience it. And then there are those ones that I want to go back to time and time again.
It's going back to me mentioning briefly that I bought Chrono Trigger 3 or 4 times. It's the fact that it's one of those games I always go back to. Whereas Uncharted, which I enjoyed very much, and I've loved the first 2 games, and I'll eventually finish the third one because I do want to play the new one. I don't have any reason to play those games again. It's one of those kinds of, because it essentially plays out like a movie. It's one of those things where I got the story, I loved it, I'll play the sequels, but I have no reason to go back. Whereas a game like Skyrim, which I have 2 different versions on the Xbox 360 and the PC. If it comes out on the Switch, I may own a third version, and I'll keep going back to it because it's one of those games where you could play completely differently so many times.
Absolutely. I run into this a lot with My Social Circle and Dragon Age.
Yeah, sure.
Where people have replayed all the Dragon Ages several times because they play as a dwarf. They play as a dwarf. They play as a human. They play as this. They play as a mage. They play as a fighter. They play as a noble. They play as a slave. They play as a whatever. I romance this person. I romance that person. I choose this. I choose that. All of those ways that, I compare so many things to Metal Gear Solid. Don't judge me. The fact that, to me, a complete playthrough of Metal Gear Solid, the original, is playing both endings.
Yeah.
And then getting to play through wearing the tuxedo.
Right.
But that is such a simple, choke point of choose this, choose this.
Yeah.
Games where you have so many choices.
The Mass Effect series was that for me.
The Mass Effect series, where depending upon if you're the sort of person that just wants to live with those choices, like that was too big of a thing, I'm fine with it. Or, man, I want to know what happens if I go full renegade.
Yeah.
What happens if this? I want to kill this person. I want to save that person. I want to, shtup that person. I want to shtup them all.
Well, it's the idea, though, that I think also plays into the life cycle of a console. The idea that if you're going back and playing these games that have replayability, the console is never truly dead. Now, obviously, is there an industry standard for dead consoles? I suppose so. I suppose once it's out of print and you can't buy through official channels those games or that console, it's dead by industry standards. But because there's so much sell and resell culture in the internet now, on the internet,
through the internet, beneath the
for
internet.
the internet, nothing really dies. And I think ultimately the death of the system is a personal definition and not the industry standard of a lot of things people don't ascribe to anyway. So I think with dealing with console life cycles as well, it's the same thing. Like for me, the 360 feels very dead because I don't play it anymore. Whereas my PS2 still has life because I just started replaying Final Fantasy 9 on it.
Right.
And I think it's the same. It's that idea is that a console is never truly dead if you're enjoying it. Much like the memory of someone you care about is they're never truly gone if you still think of them.
Right.
And I think it's very much the same for gaming consoles.
No, absolutely. Well, it's this sort of thing that one of the reasons I was thinking about this topic before we recorded this episode is in our pilot episode, we both mentioned the Virtual Boy. And even from the few people, thank you so much, listeners, who listened to that pilot episode when it was our only episode and mentioned it. And it's that fact of, it did not last long. It was so weird. It's basically the butt of so many jokes, and it's probably one of the easiest and not so easy libraries to completely have, because who's making new Virtual Boy?
Right.
Like, nobody's making homebrew Virtual Boy. Well, actually, no. There's actually a couple of people. Let me verbal backspace that. But there's really not much going on there.
But there's still a fervent fan base for it. A few of my friends loved that system, neck breaking and all, and it's shocking to me. But it really, honestly, how you enjoy what makes a gaming experience so unique, and this goes for all gaming, not just video games, is what you make of it. The fact that D&D keeps reinventing itself, the fact that board games get newer and more complex with every release of some kind of board game, is because it's based on how you enjoy it, not necessarily what the industry standard is.
Absolutely. And that fact of, in their way, you kind of make your own fun. Like with board games and everything like that, you can house rule whatever you want.
Sure.
Online gaming, new modes pop up because of how people mess around within existing frameworks, and industry acknowledges it or doesn't acknowledge it.
Yeah.
People figure out new and strange things to do with old consoles. Something that absolutely blew my mind within the last year was the Sega Saturn, which is honestly a hole in my massive console collection. I might get divorced if I buy that anytime soon. Eventually, just you wait. But because it is not a financial hardship to collect for, but it's an interesting one. Mostly because when it came out, it was notoriously difficult to develop for.
Yeah.
Because it was developed as a strong 2D console.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it excelled.
Yeah.
And then Sega, it came to their attention, well, everyone's really excited about this 3D thing. We should do something about that. Yes, we should absolutely do that. Let's take a couple of these really good 3D processors and let's put on a glove and shove it right up the port there. And they stuck extra processors on top of it. And this was during a time where the idea of multiple processors really wasn't a thing. This is before, PCs would do it and everybody had kind of the architecture and ideas behind it. And so people just go like, well, which way do I navigate this? How do I? And so a lot of so-called inferior ports, a lot of strange things that were developed for it were because nobody knew what to do with it.
Yeah.
And the multiple GPUs and all of the tech, not even the software, was so seemingly Byzantine, and certainly, I don't want to say ahead of its time, but certainly before its time of enlightenment.
Yeah.
And I bring it up because in the last year, somebody finally cracked all of the hardware code on it.
Oh, wow.
And because it had been notoriously difficult to emulate. And that's one of the other reasons why collecting for it is so expensive. Whereas some games, it's like, yeah, it's nice to have the physical, but also you can get ROMs for it, et cetera, legality questionability aside.
Right.
But it was really so difficult to emulate the Saturn because you couldn't even get the architecture right in an emulation environment. And somebody finally cracked it. And there's some great videos online of the explanations. And what this means is not only will that open the door for emulation, which might even change sort of public perception or collector perception. Public is very size dependent when you say these things. But it also means there might even be a developing homebrew community for the Sega Saturn, because as a console, it really wasn't all that weak for its time.
Right.
And it had some very interesting, unique features about it.
Yeah.
And it certainly is not without its fervent supporters.
Yeah.
And that's all a console needs to continue in one form or another. You may change the official classification on it. It may be dead in the industry, but it's not dead in the living room. It's not dead in the gamer's hands.
For sure. And I think before we wrap up, I do want to talk a little bit about our favorite dead consoles, finger quote dead consoles. And actually, it could be argued that these aren't consoles and that they're each peripherals, but I argue that they were consoles because they had separate games that you couldn't play without them. And these were my favorites because I had them, which were the Sega CD and the Sega 32X. Both that had very impressive graphical things and some really cool games, but never really took off. But I remember getting the 32X and getting Virtua Fighter for it.
Yes.
And it was like this game that I could only play in the arcades. I can now play on my Sega Genesis, and it was amazing. Or think about, and I said this off air dozens of times, but Sonic CD, which is now on the frickin' iPhone, officially on the iPhone, I might add. Sonic CD is one of the most beautiful 2D Sonic games I still think ever made, and it had one of the best soundtracks as well. And the time travel ability was really cool in the different but similar worlds and similar paths, multiple endings. It was just very cool. And I liked the development cycle for the Sega CD, which also had Virtua Fighter, which had Sewer Shark, which had Night Trap. All these
games I own, incidentally.
All interesting games, but really, it was really cool to play. I believe Duke Nukem was for that. Doom, and I thought it was fantastic. And of course, to talk about being too early or too big for your britches, now that almost everything's on CDs or Blu-rays, like they were ahead of their time, and it was really brilliant. And then the 32X, which essentially was a precursor to the N64, except Sega abandoned it because it was impossible to develop for.
Well, between that and the fact that people were still burning on the Sega CD and having to buy all these things onto what I affectionately call the Sega Megalith, because of the Mega Drive pun. And if you stuff a 32X, if you've got a Gen 1 and you put it on top of the Sega CD, you are creating this monolithic system that plays, let me think, red bordered, blue bordered, and yellow bordered Sega games.
Yeah.
Based on, again, color coding at the border. And if you get that Master System converter there, oh my goodness, happy days.
And so that was kind of really my favorite console because I also, as a kid, I had Sega Genesis before I had the Super Nintendo. And, I really wanted to get as many games as possible. I remember there was a Spider-Man game for the 32X.
Maximum Carnage.
Yeah, and so that was really a ton of fun to play that version versus the older Genesis version, which wasn't as good. So I think that might be my favorite dead console just because I have fond personal memories of it, even though I doubt it, in the scheme of things, it lasted very long.
Well, and I think that is what contributes to a system's continued existence in one form or another, those personal memories attached to it. And especially when we were talking about how there were different versions of the same games on different consoles, this led to a sort of, well, when you were a kid and you can only have one of the consoles, or even as an adult and you can only afford one of the consoles, you defend it.
Yeah.
Because, whether that's a little bit of preventing buyer's remorse or just simply like, well, I'm having fun playing this. Shut up.
Yeah.
No, I don't care how much cooler that looks. I like this.
Yeah.
Which certainly was me with my Game Gear.
Yeah.
Other kids had Game Boys and everything else, and I eventually got one for Pokemon, but I loved my Game Gear and I loved playing everything that I had on it. And I would say as far as home systems that are no longer being developed for, PS1 is my absolute all-time. That was the first system that was sort of mine in a home console sense. The Game Gear was my, and it's funny to say that, the Game Gear was the first system in my house that was sort of mine, and the PS1 was the first home console that I had a stronger ownership and identity of. It was plugged into a TV outside of my brother's room. I could go and play it whenever I wanted. Final Fantasy VII came out on that, and I had a PS1 at least a year before FF7 came out, but I still loved playing the games that I had, and it certainly contributes to why I collect for it so fervently. Certainly historically looking back, I love seeing the ideas that were tried out and the strange genre experiments that succeeded or failed or pushed forwards, or things that you look at and you go, this would never happen today.
Like Bubsy 3D.
Yeah. Or, all manner of things. And it's one that I enjoy, and it's also fun to look at the weird peripherals they made for it, because I think it was one of the last console generations that made really strange ideas. Some of the stuff they made for the Dreamcast notwithstanding.
Sure. I also missed that short lifespan when the newest PS1 came out, which was the one called the PS1, which was white with a screen that you could buy that would flip up. I remember this was back before this middle time when arcade games were making a comeback, but also there weren't a lot of arcades in New York. And a friend of mine would bring to hang out at the mall his PS1, the flip-up screen, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and 2 controllers. And we would just sit in the food court at the mall playing PS1. And it was so cool because you could never do that before.
It's the unique experiences that a certain console can bring for you.
Well, and also the precursor to this idea that the Switch is perpetuating now of a home console that you can also play while you're out.
Did the PS1 have like a battery pack or something?
So I think we just sat at a part of the food court that had a plug.
Okay.
But yeah, there was no bad battery pack for that back then. But still, I thought it was a great idea. It's why I love the GameCube so much. You wrapped up the controllers, threw them in a bag, and the console had a handle on the back.
Yeah, and that thing you could throw around.
Oh, yeah.
You could win fights with that thing.
I think the Nintendo Switch might be the first fragile console. I'm terrified to drop that thing.
And you know what? It's probably not as fragile as you think.
I think just the screen would. If that screen goes face down, it's shattering like any other screen, I would gather.
Yeah, that's just physics, I suppose.
Yeah.
Which is one of the reasons why I've always loved the Nintendo system, so the portable systems folded up. But
right. Who knows? They'll eventually release some kind of snap cover for it, and I have it in a clamshell carrying case for now that has its own handle. Effectively my own little purse for my Switch, but I don't mind.
It's your little case. That's fine. It's great.
Well, as always, thank you guys for listening. If you have a favorite dead console or a dead console gaming experience you'd like to share, please comment on our Facebook, our Twitter, or our Instagram, or you can find us on our site at Libsyn. You can comment through Facebook there, on Twitter, on wherever you want to comment, and it's Fun and Games Pod in most places. We also, of course, have an email address, which is funandgamespod@gmail.com. Email us your thoughts. We'll read them on the air because why not?
And if you have any dead consoles that you'd like us to talk about one way or another, we'd love to take take a trip down memory lane a little bit. Or if you have any suggestions for future subjects of episodes or anything else, that's how to reach us. We would love to read them. We'd love to take them on board. And we thank you so much for listening.
Yes, thank you so much.
Once again, I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And as always, happy gaming.